I see trees of green.
What I wanted to do in my few minutes is to give perspectives on farm forestry from Rita and my point of view as to why we got involved in it, what we've done, and try and complement what's been spoken about already. Both these gentlemen have been great influences in what we've done in our tree planting, and I thank them. Rowan and John have gone through a number of reasons for farm forestry: timber production, other products, farming benefits, appearance and just general environment, biodiversity, and one could add things to the list. But when Rita and I started thinking about trees, our reasons for farm forestry included those things, but included one other thing which hasn't been mentioned so far, but which was actually the major reason why we got involved, and that was carbon sequestration. When trees grow, they absorb CO2 from the atmosphere, they store the carbon in the tree and release the oxygen back to the atmosphere. So they're doing two things actually: storing the carbon, releasing the oxygen. And for us, that was the major reason why we got involved. Well, why? Why were we so involved in that, given all these other aspects of farm forestry? Well, I guess it came about because of our joint background in transport planning, and that's what we did for the professions. And in the early 2000s, we were involved with the Department of Transport in Victoria, evaluating and doing surveys about a program called Travel Smart. The idea of Travel Smart was to try to get people to change how they travel, to be smart about how they travel, and to travel in more environmentally friendly ways. So basically that meant stop driving your cars everywhere, walk more, cycle more, use public transport more, don't travel. A whole bunch of reasons which were a smarter way to get around. But one of the things we found in doing the surveys to evaluate how successful it had been was we got the same story from many people, many respondents to our survey, saying that it's not easy to change travel behaviour. Yes, it's a great idea, but there's lots of habits, lots of inertia built into the system, which means you can't just change overnight, or in the next week or month or year. You may have to wait for a whole bunch of things to change. For example, your kids leaving school, before you can really change the way you'd like to. So we started thinking, well, if the purpose of Travel Smart was to get environmental benefits, not just changing travel for the sake of it, rather than reduce the emissions from transport, why not think about offsetting the emissions? Reduce the emissions some other way while people adapt to changing their transport behaviour. And we just moved up to this region into targeting and been here for a couple of years, and we had a chance meeting with John Woodley down at the general store across the road here. We started talking about things, and one thing led to another, and we asked what John was doing. He talked about planting trees and this and that. And it planted a seed, not in the ground but in our mind, that maybe we could do the offsetting by using trees. To be honest, we never thought about it before, but it got our thought process going. When we proposed to the Department of Transport that rather than changing travel behaviour, they could offset the emissions, the response we got was, oh, that's not our job to plant trees. You'll have to go and talk to another department about that. And we tried to convince them, but unsuccessfully. So we thought, why don't we plant our own sequestration forests? Now, being an academic and a researcher, I wrote a couple of papers on it. One about cost effectiveness of carbon sequestration in harvested forests, and one how you could offset transport emissions using that. And as a result of that, it just confirmed in my mind that it made sense. That it actually made sense to plant trees to offset emissions, and it even made sense to do that with harvested plantations. Trees you're going to cut down, you're going to use a chainsaw on. And one of the things that came out of the papers was a little graph which looks like this. So this is years, and this is the volume of let's say wood, which is equal to CO2 emissions, because every cubic metre of wood that's grown absorbs a certain amount of CO2. And if you look at how trees grow, they start out relatively quick, but they eventually slow down. And they get to an equilibrium state after many years. So that would be a forest if you just planted it and left it there. Now, as John has said, a lot of trees that are planted start like that and actually go and die because they're not taken care of. And a lot of environmental plantings suffer that fate. But let's not worry about that for the moment. That's one that grows successfully. And my thought was, well, what if you harvested those trees and replanted? What would be the consequence? So, if you're planting them for timber, you would do some things which we're going to talk about later about thinning and pruning. You'd actually cut off some of the wood. You'd take out some of the trees. So you would suffer a small reduction over that time. And then you cut it down. Now the Kyoto Protocol says that if you cut a tree down, you lose all the carbon that's stored in the tree. It's as if you cut the tree down, take it out in the middle of the field and burn a lot of it. But we know that's not what happens with harvested trees. You do some of that, but you really only lose some of the carbon. The rest goes into your table, your building timbers, a whole bunch of things where the carbon is actually stored way beyond the end of the plantation. And if you then plant again, repeated rotations of that harvested forest gives you something that looks like a bit like the Opera House, where eventually the volume of wood or the CO2 that's being absorbed and stored either in the growing trees or in the products from the grown trees that have been harvested will eventually outnumber the native forest that's stable, the forest that is vegetable. So when I saw this coming out of the research, I thought, well, you can harvest and sequester and get all those other benefits in one go. So that's why we decided to establish our own forests rather than rely on someone else to do it for us. After a couple of years, we also formed a carbon trading company called TreeSmart, playing off TravelSmart, where we acted on behalf of farm foresters around Victoria. We had about 100 people signed up who were too small in themselves to worry about the carbon sequestration and what they could get for the sequestered carbon financially. And we did that on behalf of them and then distributed profits back to them. So it was a different path into farm forestry than what's been described, but just as valuable. Everyone's got their own reasons why they get into it. We established 2 farm forestry sites. This is one at Blue Range Close Thornton, about 5 or 8 kilometres outside here. This was after the contour ripping had been done for private planting. That was established in 2006 and it was 25 hectares of trees on a 40-acre lot. This plot was actually used as one of our field sites for the previous Master Tree Growers, because we were just in the stage of establishing it in 2005, and we actually went out there and we dug soil pits and we did all sorts of things for the Master Tree Growers program. You'll notice there's a lot of remnant trees there, and all of those were left. And we ripped around them, or, as shown here, we just left the natural state there around those trees. We enjoyed doing it so much, particularly in conjunction with John Woodley, that a couple of years later we decided, well, let's do it again. And so we established a plot at Penumbra in 2008. This time it was bigger, and yes, Rowan, we did do more than 50 hectares. This is 55 hectares of trees of various types, about 7 or 8 different species, under different conditions. It's on a 160 hectare block. So it was a big old farming block with lots of hill country, and basically we planted the trees in the areas which they would grow. We will be going to this site in session 3. So you'll see that, and we'll talk about, Rowan will talk about measuring trees, and we'll talk about a few other aspects of it as well. Just leave you with one little thought about trees, and this is our input-output tree. And I like to think of it this way because there's a lot of things go into a plantation, farm forestry plantation, a lot of things come out of it. So if we look at the bottom, the inputs, one big input is time. It's going to take a long time for your plantation to grow. Minimum of 25 years, could be 50, 70, depends what you want to do with the trees. Money. It always is going to cost you money. Equipment, labour, seedlings, water, nutrients, CO2 is an input to growing the trees. And there are many outputs, and just some of them. Saw logs, which has been the traditional output, but there's other sort of lumber, peel logs, all sorts of other things you can do with the timber. Bioenergy, which is a sort of a fancy name for firewood, but it goes beyond just firewood. There's lots of other ways in which you can create bioenergy. Shade and shelter for your farm, the sequestered carbon, flowers for the birds and bees, seeds, we'll talk about that in a few weeks' time, and serenity. When we established our 2 tree farms, one other aspect of it was we bought the land, and, well, we didn't buy the land, our self-managed superannuation fund bought the land as an investment. And when we asked our accountant whether we could do that, could we use our super fund to buy land on which to establish a farm forestry site? He said, "Ooh, no one's ever asked me that." So he went and did some research, asked the ATO and a few other people, came back and said, yes, it is possible, but what you'll have to do is buy the land with the super fund, that's okay, but a super fund can't run a business. So it can't be the tree farm, it can't be the farm forestry company. So we had to establish something which would actually then plant the trees on the land owned by the super company and pay rent to the super company every year, which became the income. The ATO was quite happy with that. But our accountant said that there's one little restriction. The ATO has a requirement that you don't enjoy your asset. Now what they meant by enjoy your asset was you can't buy an apartment on the Gold Coast and then go and live there. That's enjoying your asset. So we promised our accountant that every time we went to Penumbra, we would not enjoy it. Now I might break that rule next week when I go back there again, because sometimes we've thought about selling Penumbra, because we did sell Blue Range as part of our superannuation. The whole point of it was to give us money to live on in retirement. We'd run out of money, so we had to sell something. So we did sell Blue Range to another family who was growing it onto completion. And we've thought about selling Penumbra, but every time we go there, can we find something else to sell? Because it really does grab you. It really is that home thing. And both John and Rowan have talked about legacies. When you get to our age, you start thinking about that. And I've been really pleased in the last year or two that my daughter, who lives near Castlemaine, has planted 3,000 trees on her little farm by herself with a bit of assistance from others. And very recently she's got a job with the Botanical Gardens of Castlemaine as a gardener. So she's now working with trees. So I don't think she'll have any problem wanting to be inheriting Penumbra when the trees are a little bit older. Okay, so what I've tried to do is just give our perspectives and adding to the perspectives that John and Rowan have talked about. And you'll have your perspectives as well. You'll have other reasons why you may or may not want to get into farm forestry.
I think to myself, what a wonderful